Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and after spending 40 weeks of Third Age Thursdays doing deep dives into the poetry and songs from The Lord of the Rings, well, in a way, I'm sad to say that it's time we move on to something else. So this series, we're going to take a look at Middle-earth artifacts that show up in the Third Age. No, not the Rings of Power. We'll skip those for now. Instead, we're going to start with a couple of episodes focused on artifacts that show up in The Hobbit. Now, after Gandalf cleverly delayed the trolls, preventing them from roasting the dwarves slowly, mincing them fine, and boiling them, or just squashing them into jelly, the company found the trolls' hideout, where we read, "There were bones on the floor, and a nasty smell was in the air. But there was a good deal of food jumbled carelessly on shelves and on the ground, among an untidy litter of plunder, of all sorts, from brass buttons to pots full of gold coins standing in a corner. There were lots of clothes, too, hanging on the walls. Too small for trolls, I am afraid they belonged to victims. And among them were several swords of various makes, shapes, and sizes. Two caught their eyes particularly because of their beautiful scabbards and jeweled hilts. Gandalf and Thorin each took one of these, and Bilbo took a knife in a leather sheath. It would have made only a tiny pocket knife for a troll, but it was as good as a short sword for the hobbit." "These look like good blades," said the wizard, half drawing them and looking at them curiously. "They were not made by any troll, nor by any smith among men in these parts and days. But when we can read the runes on them, we shall know more about them." Now, before we get any further, what do we know so far about these swords? Not made by trolls, well, that one's kind of obvious, but also not made by any smith among men, locally or even in this age. We also know physically they have runes on them, and that their hilts are jeweled. Now, in the next chapter, Thorin and company reach Rivendell, where we learn a great deal more. Elrond knew all about runes of every kind. That day he looked at the swords they had brought from the troll's lair, and he said, "These are not troll make. They are old swords, very old swords of the High Elves of the West, my kin. They were made in Gondolin for the Goblin Wars. They must have come from a dragon's horde, or goblin plunder, for dragons and goblins destroyed that city many ages ago. This, Thorin, the rune's name Orcrist, the goblin cleaver in the ancient tongue of Gondolin. It was a famous blade. This, Gandalf, was Glamdring, foe hammer, that the king of Gondolin once wore. Keep them well." "Whence did the trolls get them, I wonder?" said Thorin, looking at his sword with new interest. "I could not say," said Elrond. "But one may guess that your trolls had plundered other plunderers, or come on the remnants of old robberies in some hold in the mountains. I have heard that there are still forgotten treasures of old to be found in the deserted caverns of the mines of Moria since the dwarf and goblin war." So, starting with Glamdring, let's dive in. The word is Sindarin, from the element glam, which means shouting, confused noise, but it's used to describe orcs, the Glamhoth, which means the Din Horde. The element dring means beat or strike, according to the etymologies of the 1930s. Now, according to Parma El Delamberon 17, what else? It's a noun for hammer, and used only in this word, Glamdring. Thus, foe hammer is a literal translation of the Sindarin. Now, we learn later that the orcs call it simply beater. Now, if it belonged to the king of Gondolin, then Glamdring was once the sword of Turgon. Imagine this same sword that Gandalf wields throughout the Legendarium, once being wielded by Turgon during the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, when Turgon and his men came unsummoned and unlooked for, 10,000 strong, with bright mail and long swords and spears like a forest. It was so famous a blade, or infamous, depending on your perspective, that even the orcs of the Third Age some 6,500 years later knew about it. Now, how it got from the fall of Gondolin to a troll's cave in the foothills of the Misty Mountains really is a mystery. Elrond suggests that perhaps it's been plundered over and over, or maybe carried off to the Misty Mountains in one journey after the fall of Gondolin. Whatever the case, it ended up in this most unlikely place, right next to another sword from the same city, Orcrist. Now, its name is also Sindarin, compounded from orch, meaning orc, and crist, meaning cleaver, Thus again, Goblin Cleaver is a literal translation of the Sindarin. Now, unlike Dring for hammer in Fohammer, we do see Christ in one other word, Angrist, the name of the knife used by Beren to retrieve a Silmaril from the crown of Morgoth. There it means iron cleaver. And while we don't know precisely who among the lords of Gondolin bore Orcrist, I like to think it was Ecthelion. Headcanon aside, whoever wielded it did so well. After all, the orcs 6,500 years later see it and recall it with terror, the narrative telling us that it had killed hundreds of goblins in its time when the fair elves of Gondolin hunted them in the hills or did battle before their walls. Now, unlike Gandalf and Glamdring, Thorin didn't get to use Orcrist very much. It was taken from him in the halls of the Elven King when he and the other dwarves were imprisoned there, so he didn't get to fight with it in the Battle of the Five Armies. However, we do read of the sword's fate after Thorin's death. Upon his tomb, the Elven King then laid Orcrist, the elvish sword that had been taken from Thorin in captivity. It is said in songs that it gleamed ever in the dark if foes approached, and the fortress of the dwarves could not be taken by surprise. Now, next week we'll touch on that sword, more like a letter opener really, that Bilbo took from the Troll's Cave, and if we have time, one other very important artifact from The Hobbit. But for now, folks, thank you for joining me for this week's Third Age Thursday. Be sure to come back tomorrow as we continue the story of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin on First Age Friday. Check out patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, get a bonus episode every week, and more. Podcast listeners, be sure to subscribe to the show in your apps. For those on YouTube, subscribe to the channel to get all of the PPP productions. And be sure you're all following @PrancingPonyPod on your social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.